The night Shaquille O'Neal was told he did not belong. He was wearing a charcoal wool coat with no lapel pin, plain dark trousers, and shoes that were clean but not expensive looking. No entourage, no security detail, no one in his ear. Just him and the man beside him. An elderly gentleman in a wheelchair, a burgundy blanket across his knees, a hearing aid in his left ear, eyes still sharp at 81. Rolling quietly down the marble approach of the Meridian Club on West 54th Street in Manhattan on a Thursday evening in January. It was 7:14 p.m. The air outside was 19 degrees. The awning above the front entrance was charcoal and gold. Two doormen in dark coats flanked the entrance. The heavier of the two stepped forward. His name tag read, Brendan. He was broad, unhurried, wearing the kind of practiced authority that gets built over years of managing who gets in and who doesn't. He looked at SHAQ, all 7 feet, all $400 million, all 4 championships, one of the most recognized human beings on earth, and he said, "Good evening, sir. Members only tonight. Are you on the list?" "No, it's outside Tomasaman." SHAQ said his name, calmly, plainly, the way he always says his name. Brendan looked at a tablet. He scrolled. He looked up. He said with the particular smoothness of someone who has delivered this sentence many times without incident, "I'm not finding you here, sir. This is a private members club. If you'd like to apply for consideration, I can get you a card." He looked at the man in the wheelchair. He did not look at him for long. He looked back at SHAQ and said, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." SHAQ looked at Brendan. He looked at the man in the wheelchair. He looked back at Brendan. He said 2 words, "I know." Brendan blinked. He waited. Nothing followed. And that was the moment that nobody standing on West 54th Street that night, not Brendan, not the other doorman, not the 3 people who had just arrived behind SHAQ in a town car, understood yet. But the man in the wheelchair understood. He had been waiting 17 years for this exact moment. And when it came, he closed his eyes and said nothing. And the hint of something moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile. Too old and too full for a smile. Something older than that. But before you understand what those 2 words meant, you need to notice the 3 things SHAQ noticed on his way up that marble approach. The first was the crest above the door, a stylized letter M inside an octagonal frame, rendered in hammered brass. It was slightly off-center, not incorrectly installed, but deliberately so, tilted 3 degrees clockwise, the way it had been since the building's original interior designer specified it in 1987. SHAQ saw it. He looked at it for 1 full second. He kept walking. The second was the floor of the entrance vestibule, black and white marble, a specific diagonal herringbone pattern, the same pattern in the same proportions as a floor he had seen in a photograph once, a photograph in a shoebox in the back of a closet in a house in Newark, New Jersey. He looked down at it. He did not stop. The third was a brass plaque on the wall just inside the entrance, partially obscured by a floral arrangement. Meridian Club, established 1987. Original design, Lester Gene O'Neill, architect. The plaque had been there since the building opened. No one at the door had ever looked at it twice. SHAQ looked at it. He said nothing. He turned back to Brendan and said his 2 words, "I know." Now here is what nobody on that sidewalk knew. Here is what Brendan did not know, what the town car passengers did not know, what not a single member of the Meridian Club had been told when they received their membership cards and paid their annual dues. Stay with this video until the end, because the thing Shaquille O'Neal had been carrying for the last 17 years is not the kind of thing you can explain in a sentence. You have to go back to the beginning. Lester Gene O'Neill was born in 1941 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the fifth of 6 children, in a house on a street that flooded every spring and dried into red clay every August. He was the only one of the 6 who could draw, not just well, but with the particular obsessive precision of someone for whom drawing was not a talent, but a way of surviving his own mind. He drew floor plans at 8. At 12, he had taught himself the rudiments of architectural drafting from a library book with a cracked spine that had been donated to the colored branch and handled so many times, the pages were soft as cloth. At 16, he applied to a magnet school in New Orleans. He was accepted. He was the first in the family to leave Baton Rouge for an education and the first to come back with a degree. Though the degree came later, LSU, 1965, Bachelor of Architecture, 3rd in his class, a fact the department chair noted in his file and then never mentioned publicly, because the professional associations Lester would need to join were not, in 1965, accepting members who looked like him. He built his practice anyway, slowly. Mostly residential work at first, then commercial, then, in the late 1970s, the kind of institutional and hospitality work that gets written about. By 1987, Lester Gene O'Neill was one of 12 architects in New York who could be trusted with a project of the Meridian Club's ambition. He was chosen, and he delivered, and the finished building, the diagonal herringbone marble, the deliberately off-center crest, the north-facing light wells that make the upper dining room feel like an open sky even in January, was the finest work of his career. He was paid. He was not invited to join. His name went on a plaque on the inside wall of the entrance, half hidden by a floral arrangement that had stood in front of it since 1989. And that was where the relationship between Lester Gene O'Neill and the Meridian Club ended. Except for his grandson. Shaquille O'Neal did not call Lester his grandfather. He called him Pop Pop, the way he had called him since he was 4 years old and could not yet manage the full syllables, and the name had never been corrected because nobody wanted to correct it, because Pop Pop was what he was. Lester had been present at every graduation, every draft night, every championship parade he could physically get to. He had watched his grandson become the most famous basketball player on the planet with the exact same expression he had used to watch him attempt to tie his shoelaces at age 3. Patient, specific, unimpressed by the struggle, certain about the outcome. Lester's wife, SHAQ's great-grandmother Oletha, had died in 2006. She had kept, in a shoebox in the back of a closet, a photograph of Lester standing on the construction site of the Meridian Club in 1986. Hard hat, blueprints rolled under his arm, the steel frame of the building rising behind him. It was one of 19 photographs in the shoebox, all of them of buildings Lester had designed, none of them framed, none of them displayed, because Lester was not a man who displayed things. He built them. Oletha framed the moments he would not frame. She kept them in a shoebox so that her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren would know what had been built. SHAQ had seen that photograph at age 12. He had held it in both hands for a long time. He had asked Lester about the building, and Lester had told him the name and the address and had said, in the even tone he used for all facts, "They put my name on the wall inside. I have not been back inside since." He said it without bitterness. The way you state a coordinate. This is where the thing is. He never mentioned it again. SHAQ mentioned it again. Quietly, privately, 17 years ago, when Lester turned 64 and the Meridian Club underwent its second major ownership change. SHAQ was in his early 30s. He was generating the kind of income that makes certain things possible that were not possible before. He had conversations with certain people. He was told that the club's membership structure was not changing and that acquisition inquiries would not be considered. He was told this politely. He filed it and waited. He did not stop waiting. 9 months before the night on West 54th Street, the Meridian Club's parent holding company entered a restructuring period. A real estate investment group with a specific interest in landmark hospitality properties made an offer. The offer was accepted. The investment group was, at its controlling interest level, operated through a family office whose principal SHAQ had known for 11 years. A phone call was made. A wire transfer was executed. The diagonal herringbone marble floor, the off-center brass crest, the north-facing light wells, the half-hidden plaque, all of it became, in a transaction that closed on a Tuesday morning in October, the property of a holding structure that would take a forensic accountant several days to trace back to its source. SHAQ had not told Lester about any of this. Not the 9 months of negotiation, not the wire, not the closing. He had said only 3 weeks before the January evening, "Pop, you remember West 54th Street? I need you to come with me somewhere on Thursday." Lester had looked at him. He was 81. He did not ask follow-up questions. He said, "What time?" He was in the wheelchair because his knees had been difficult for 2 years, not because he was frail. His eyes, behind the glasses, were the same eyes that had read architectural drafting books in the Colored Branch Library in Baton Rouge at age 12. They missed nothing. Now back to the sidewalk. Back to Brendan. Inside the Meridian Club that Thursday evening, at a corner table on the second floor, a woman named Sylvia Fontaine was hosting a small dinner. Sylvia was 62, a retired federal judge, a member of the Meridian Club for 22 years. A woman whose presence in any room tended to organize the room around her without any visible effort on her part. She had 4 guests. She was explaining something about a wine region. She was not aware, at 7:14 p.m., of what was happening at the front entrance 2 floors below her. The maitre d' on the ground floor, a man named Henri, 23 years at the club, the institutional memory of the building in human form, had been near the host station when the exchange at the door began. He had heard the name SHAQ said. He had frozen for approximately 2 seconds, the way you freeze when you hear something that means something large is happening, and you have not yet finished computing what it is. Then he had walked, at controlled speed, toward the entrance. He reached Brendan's shoulder at the same moment Brendan was finishing his sentence about stepping aside. He said very quietly, "Brendan." 1 word. Brendan turned. Henri's expression was not alarm. It was the expression of someone conveying information in the most efficient format available. He looked at SHAQ. He looked at the man in the wheelchair. He looked back at Brendan. He said again, even more quietly, "Brendan." Brendan looked at the tablet. He looked at the entrance. He looked at Lester. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite shame, not quite panic, but living uncomfortably close to both. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned a set of rules and applied them in good faith, and had just discovered at 7:14 p.m. on a Thursday in January that the rules had changed in a way nobody had told him about. Henri said, "Mr. O'Neill, please forgive us. Welcome home." He said the last 2 words with full awareness of what they meant. He said them looking at Lester when he said them. But you are going to have to wait just a little longer for what happened next. Because standing 12 feet away, near the coat check alcove, was a young woman named Camille Broussard who had nothing to do with any of this, except that she did. Camille was 26. She was a first-year associate at an architecture firm on 57th Street. She was at the Meridian Club that evening because her firm's senior partner had invited her to a client dinner, and she had arrived 7 minutes early and was waiting near the coat check exactly as advised. She had her portfolio under her arm because she had come directly from a site visit. She was wearing her good coat. She was trying very hard not to look like she was watching the entrance, and she was completely failing. She had recognized SHAQ immediately. She had recognized the name on the plaque. She had walked past the plaque. She had read the plaque. She was one of perhaps 11 people in the last decade who had read the plaque because she was an architecture associate and she read every plaque. And she had understood, in the space of 30 seconds of watching, more of what was happening than Brendan had understood in 3 minutes of managing it. Her grandfather had been a contractor. He had worked on a job in 1986 in Manhattan, a private club on West 54th. He had told her once about the architect on that job, a man from Baton Rouge who drew with the kind of precision that made the tradesmen on site speak about him, in the way tradesmen speak about architects they actually respect, which is rarely. He had told her the architect's name. She had not thought about it in years. She thought about it now. She had also, 4 months ago, submitted a cold application to a foundation that funds architecture education initiatives for students from underrepresented backgrounds. A foundation she had found listed in a footnote in a journal article, operating under a name she had not recognized, run through a family office she had not been able to trace. She had submitted her application because the mission statement had moved her, and she had not heard back, and she had stopped expecting to. The lobby was very quiet. SHAQ and Lester came inside. Henri held the door himself. SHAQ pushed the wheelchair at a pace calibrated to Lester's comfort. As they passed the entrance wall, SHAQ stopped the wheelchair in front of the floral arrangement that had stood in front of the plaque since 1989. He moved the arrangement to the side table. He stepped back. He let Lester look at the plaque. He put both hands in his coat pockets and looked at the floor, at the diagonal herringbone marble, and said nothing. Lester looked at the plaque for a long time. Meridian Club, established 1987. Original design, Lester Jean O'Neill, architect. He had not read those words in 37 years. His hands were folded in his lap. He did not cry. He was 81, and he had used his tears in places that needed them more than this. But he sat there for a long time, and the room held around him, and nobody moved and nobody spoke. And it was the loudest quiet in a room that SHAQ had ever stood in. Then Lester said, "You moved the flowers." SHAQ said, "Nobody's moving them back." Lester said, That was the whole conversation. Henri, who had been standing at a respectful distance, stepped forward. He said that a table had been prepared. He said this understanding that the table had not technically been prepared, because this visit had not been in any system, but that a table would be prepared within 3 minutes and that this was not a problem. This was the opposite of a problem. Sylvia Fontaine, on the second floor, had at this point been informed by a server of something that required her to briefly excuse herself from her dinner. She came to the top of the stairs. She looked down into the lobby. She was a federal judge for 20 years. She was not a person given to visible emotion in public. She gripped the banister once, and then released it and smoothed her jacket and went back to her table. She told her guests that something very right had just happened in this building. She did not explain further. They did not ask. Now here is what Camille Broussard did not know she knew until 37 minutes later, when she was seated at the client dinner and her senior partner introduced her across the table to a gentleman from the family office that had recently acquired the Meridian Club's holding company. The gentleman said, pleasantly, that the acquisition had been an interesting project. He said the principal had had a specific interest in the building for a long time. He mentioned, because it was a table of architects and the detail was relevant to them, that the original architect was a man named Lester Jean O'Neill, and that the principal had wanted, among other things, to ensure that O'Neill's name was no longer obscured by a flower arrangement. He said this lightly, as if it were a small thing. Camille set down her fork. She said, "O'Neill." The gentleman said yes. Camille said, "Is the principal by any chance?" The gentleman smiled and said nothing. She picked up her fork again. She looked at the plaque across the lobby, now fully visible from where she sat. She looked at it for a long time. Then she thought about the foundation application she had submitted 4 months ago and heard nothing about. She thought about her grandfather's story, the architect from Baton Rouge, the job on West 54th. She thought about the diagonal herringbone floor. She thought about a man in a wheelchair with sharp eyes looking at a plaque for the first time in 37 years. She was, she would later say, completely unprepared for how small the world turned out to be. 3 weeks after that evening, Camille Broussard received a letter. It was from the foundation she had applied to 4 months ago. It offered her a full 2-year fellowship. The letter was signed by the foundation's board chair. Beneath the signature was a printed line, "In memory of Olitha O'Neill, who kept the photographs." Brendan received, through the club's new management, a mandatory orientation session with the incoming operational director. He was not dismissed. He was a man who had applied a system someone else built, and the system was wrong. Not him. The orientation was thorough. He completed it. He came back. He greeted the next person at the door without a tablet. Henri retired 14 months later, after 24 years. His final shift ended with a dinner in his honor in the main dining room. He said, in the brief remarks he was asked to give, that in 24 years he had seen one moment at this club that he would carry the rest of his life. He did not describe it. He said only that it involved flowers, a wheelchair, and a man who had been waiting 37 years to read a plaque in his own building. He raised his glass. Everyone raised theirs, and Lester Jean O'Neill, architect, born 1941 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, returned to the Meridian Club the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and the one after that. He sat at a table near the north-facing windows in the dining room he had designed in 1986, and he ordered the same thing every time, coffee, a soft roll, and whatever the fish was. And he looked at the light coming in through the wells he had specified, and he did not say much, and he did not need to. There is a photograph. It was taken by a server on a Thursday evening in February, on a phone, without being asked. It shows 2 people at a corner table. One is very large and wearing a plain sweater. One is very old and wearing a burgundy blanket across his knees. They are not looking at the camera. They are looking at something outside the frame, probably the light or the street or nothing in particular. But there is something in both of their faces that a person, looking at it, cannot quite name and cannot look away from. The photograph is framed now. It hangs in the entrance hallway of every property Shaquille O'Neal has ever owned, next to the strip of masking tape that says, "Do not be a reaction, be a response." He put it there because some buildings you build with steel and marble and herringbone floors, and some buildings you build out of the 17 years you spent waiting for the right moment, and some buildings your grandfather built before you were born, in a city that was not ready to let him in. And your job, the only job that matters, is to hold the door open and move the flowers out of the way. He did not say this to anyone. He did not need to. His great-grandmother Olitha kept the photographs. She knew what they were for. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And has someone in your family built something that didn't get the recognition it deserved? We read every single one. If this story reached you, let the like button know. Not for the algorithm, but because somewhere there is a Lester at a table near a north-facing window eating a soft wall in the building he designed. And he deserves to know his story traveled. Subscribe to this family if you haven't already. Every person who joins makes it possible to find the next story, and the next one is already waiting. We will see you there.